Cupid's Revenge by Charles Lamb. Date unknown. Leontius, Duke of Lycia, who in times past had borne the character of a wise and just governor, and was endeared to all ranks of his subjects, in his latter days fell into a sort of dotage, which manifested itself in an extravagant fondness for his daughter Hydaspes. This young maiden, with the prince Leucippus her brother, were the only remembrances left to him of a deceased and beloved consort. pg 408 for her nothing was thought too precious. Existence was of no value to him, but as it afforded opportunities of gratifying her wishes. To be instrumental in relieving her from the least little pain or grief, he would have lavished his treasures to the giving away of the one half of his dukedom. All this deference on the part of the parent had yet no power upon the mind of the daughter to move her at any time to solicit any unbecoming suit, or to disturb the even tenor of her thoughts. The humility and dutifulness of her carriage seemed to keep pace with his apparent willingness to release her from the obligations of either. She might have satisfied her wildest humours and caprices, but in truth no such troublesome guests found harbour in the bosom of the quiet and unaspiring maiden. Thus far the prudence of the princess served to counteract any ill effects which this ungovernable partiality in a parent was calculated to produce in a less virtuous nature than Hydaspes's. And this foible of the duke's, so long as no evil resulted from it, was passed over by the courtiers as a piece of harmless frenzy. But upon a solemn day, a sad one as it proved for Lycia, when the returning anniversary of the princess's birth was kept with extraordinary rejoicings, the infatuated father set no bounds to his folly, but would have his subjects to do homage to her for that day, as to their natural sovereign, as if he indeed had been dead, and she, to the exclusion of the male succession, was become the rightful ruler of Lycia. He saluted her by the style of duchess, and with a terrible oath in the presence of his nobles, he confirmed to her the grant of all things whatsoever that she should demand on that day, and for the 6 next following, and if she should ask anything the execution of which must be deferred until after his death, he pronounced a dreadful curse upon his son and successor if he failed to see to the performance of it. Thus encouraged, the princess stepped forth with a modest boldness, and, as if assured of no denial, spake as follows. But before we acquaint you with the purport of her speech, we must premise that in the land of Lycia, which was at that time pagan, above all their other gods the inhabitants did in an especial manner adore the deity who was supposed to have influence in the disposing of people's affections in love. Him, by the name of god Cupid, they feigned to be a beautiful pg 409 boy, and winged, as indeed, between young persons these frantic passions are usually least under constraint. While the wings might signify the haste with which these ill-judged attachments are commonly dissolved, and do indeed go away as lightly as they come, flying away in an instant to light upon some newer fancy, they painted him blindfolded, because these silly affections of lovers make them blind to the defects of the beloved object, which everyone is quick-sighted enough to discover but themselves, or because love is for the most part led blindly, rather than directed by the open eye of the judgment, in the hasty choice of a mate. Yet with that inconsistency of attributes with which the heathen people commonly overcomplimented their deities, this blind love, this Cupid, they figured with a bow and arrows, and being sightless, they yet feigned him to be a notable archer and an unerring marksman. No heart was supposed to be proof against the point of his inevitable dart. By such incredible fictions did these poor pagans make a shift to excuse their vanities, and to give a sanction to their irregular affections, under the notion that love was irresistible, whereas in a well-regulated mind these amorous conceits either find no place at all, or, having gained a footing, are easily stifled in the beginning by a wise and manly resolution. This frenzy in the people had long been a source of disquiet to the discreet princess, and many were the conferences she had held with the virtuous prince, her brother, as to the best mode of taking off the minds of the Lycians from this vain superstition. An occasion, furnished by the blind grant of the old duke, their father, seemed now to present itself. The courtiers, then, being assembled to hear the demand which the princess should make, began to conjecture, each one according to the bent of his own disposition, what the thing would be that she should ask for. One said, now surely she will ask to have the disposal of the revenues of some wealthy province, to lay them out, as was the manner of Eastern princesses, in costly dresses and jewels, becoming a lady of so great expectancies. Another thought that she would seek an extension of power, as women naturally love rule and dominion. But the most part were in hope that she was about to beg the hand of some neighbour prince in marriage, who, by the wealth and contiguity of his dominions, might add strength and safety to the realm of Lycia, but PG 410 in none of these things was the expectation of these crafty and worldly-minded courtiers gratified. For Hydaspes, first making lowly obeisance to her father, and thanking him on bended knees for so great grace conferred upon her, according to a plan preconcerted with Leucippus, made suit as follows. Your loving care of me, O princely father, by which in my tenderest age you made up to me for the loss of a mother at those years when I was scarcely able to comprehend the misfortune, and your bounties to me ever since, have left me nothing to ask for myself, as wanting and desiring nothing. But for the people whom you govern I beg and desire a boon. It is known to all nations that the men of Lycia are noted for a vain and fruitless superstition, the more hateful as it bears a show of true religion, but is indeed nothing more than a self-pleasing and bold wantonness. Many ages before this, when every man had taken to himself a trade, as hating idleness far worse than death, someone that gave himself to sloth and wine, finding himself by his neighbours rebuked for his unprofitable life, framed to himself a god whom he pretended to obey in his dishonesty, and for a name he called him Cupid. This god of merely man's creating, as the nature of man is ever credulous of any vice which takes part with his dissolute conditions, quickly found followers enough. They multiplied in every age, especially among your Lycians, who to this day remain adorers of this drowsy deity, who certainly was first invented in drink, as sloth and luxury are commonly the first movers in these idle love passions. This winged boy, for so they fancy him, has his sacrifices, his loose images set up in the land through all the villages, nay, your own sacred palace is not exempt from them, to the scandal of sound devotion and dishonour of the true deities, which are only they who give good gifts to man, as Ceres who gives us corn, the planter of the olive palace, Neptune who directs the track of ships over the great ocean and binds distant lands together in friendly commerce, the inventor of medicine and music, Apollo, and the cloud-compelling thunderer of Olympus, whereas the gifts of this idol deity, if indeed he have a being at all out of the brain of his frantic worshippers, usually prove destructive and pernicious. My suit then is that this unseemly idol throughout the land be plucked down and cast into the fire, and that the adoring PG 411 of the same may be prohibited on pain of death to any of your subjects henceforth found so offending. Leontius, startled at this unexpected demand from the princess, with tears besought her to ask some wiser thing, and not to bring down upon herself and him the indignation of so great a god. There is no such god as you dream of, said then Leucippus boldly, who had hitherto forborne to second the petition of the princess, but a vain opinion of him has filled the land with love and wantonness. Every young man and maiden that feel the least desire to one another dare in no case to suppress it, for they think it to be Cupid's motion, and that he is a god. Thus pressed by the solicitations of both his children, and fearing the oath which he had taken, in an evil hour the misgiving father consented, and a proclamation was sent throughout all the provinces for the putting down of the idol, and the suppression of the established Cupid worship. Notable, you may be sure, was the stir made in all places among the priests, and among the artificers in gold, in silver, or in marble, who made a gainful trade, either in serving at the altar or in the manufacture of the images, no longer to be tolerated. The cry was clamorous as that at Ephesus, when a kindred idol was in danger, for great had been Cupid of the Lycians. Nevertheless the power of the Duke, backed by the power of his more popular children, prevailed, and the destruction of every vestige of the old religion was but as the work of one day throughout the country. And now, as the pagan chronicles of Lycia inform us, the displeasure of Cupid went out, the displeasure of a great god, flying through all the dukedom, and sowing evils. But upon the first movers of the profanation his angry hand lay heaviest, and there was imposed upon them a strange misery, that all might know that Cupid's revenge was mighty. With his arrows hotter than plagues or than his own anger, did he fiercely right himself, nor could the prayers of a few concealed worshippers, nor the smoke arising from an altar here and there which had escaped the general overthrow, avert his wrath, or make him cease from vengeance, until he had made of the once flourishing country of Lycia a most wretched land. He sent no famines, he let loose no cruel wild beasts among them, inflictions, with one or other of PG 412, which the rest of the Olympian deities are fabled to have visited the nations under their displeasure, but took a nearer course of his own, and his invisible arrows went to the moral heart of Lycia, infecting and filling court and country with desires of unlawful marriages, unheard of and monstrous affections, prodigious and misbecoming unions. The symptoms were first visible in the changed bosom of Hydaspes, this exemplary maiden, whose cold modesty, almost to a failing, had discouraged the addresses of so many princely suitors that had sought her hand in marriage, by the venom of this inward pestilence came on a sudden to cast eyes of affection upon a mean and deformed creature, Zoilus by name, who was a dwarf, and lived about the palace, the common jest of the courtiers. In her besotted eyes he was grown a goodly gentleman, and to her maidens, when any of them reproached him with the defect of his shape in her hearing, she would reply that, to them, indeed, he might appear defective, and unlike a man, as indeed no man was like unto him, for in form and complexion he was beyond painting. He is like, she said, to nothing that we have seen, yet he doth resemble Apollo as I have fancied him, when rising in the east he bestirs himself and shakes daylight from his hair. And, overcome with a passion which was heavier than she could bear, she confessed herself a wretched creature, and implored forgiveness of god Cupid, whom she had provoked, and if possible that he would grant it to her, that she might enjoy her love. Nay, she would court this piece of deformity to his face. And when the wretch, supposing it to be done in mockery, has said that he could wish himself more ill-shaped than he was, so it could contribute to make her grace merry, she would reply, Oh, think not that I jest, unless it be a jest not to esteem my life in comparison with thine, to hang 1,000 kisses in an hour upon those lips, unless it be a jest to vow that I am willing to become your wife, and to take obedience upon me. And by his own white hand, taking it in hers, so strong was the delusion, she besought him to swear to marry her. The term had not yet expired of the 7 days within which the doting duke had sworn to fulfill her will, when in pursuance of this frenzy she presented herself before her father, leading in the dwarf by the hand, and in the face of all the courtiers solemnly demanding his hand in marriage. PG 413, and when the apish creature made show of blushing at the unmerited honour, she, to comfort him, bade him not to be ashamed, for in her eyes he was worth a kingdom. And now, too late, did the fond father repent him of his dotage, but when by no importunity he could prevail upon her to desist from her suit, for his oath's sake, he must needs consent to the marriage. But the ceremony was no sooner, to the derision of all present, performed, than with the just feelings of an outraged parent, he commanded the head of the presumptuous bridegroom to be stricken off, and committed the distracted princess close prisoner to her chamber, where, after many deadly swoonings with intermingled outcries upon the cruelty of her father, she in no long time after died, making ineffectual appeals to the last, to the mercy of the offended power, the power that had laid its heavy hand upon her, to the bereavement of her good judgment first, and, finally, to the extinction of a life that might have proved a blessing to Lycia. Leontius had scarcely time to be sensible of her danger before a fresh cause for mourning overtook him. His son Leucippus, who had hitherto been a pattern of strict life and modesty, was stricken with a second arrow from the deity, offended for his overturned altars, in which the prince had been a chief instrument. The god caused his heart to fall away, and his crazed fancy to be smitten with the excelling beauty of a wicked widow, by name Barca. This woman, in the first days of her mourning for her husband, by her dissembling tears and affected coyness, had drawn Leucippus so cunningly into her snares, that before she would grant him a return of love, she extorted from the easy-hearted prince a contract of marriage, to be fulfilled in the event of his father's death. This guilty intercourse, which they covered with the name of marriage, was not carried with such secrecy, but that a rumour of it ran about the palace, and by some officious courtier was brought to the ears of the old duke, who, to satisfy himself of the truth, came hastily to the house of Barca, where he found his son courting. Taking the prince to task roundly, he sternly asked who that creature was that had bewitched him out of his honour thus. Then Barca, pretending ignorance of the duke's person, haughtily demanded of Leucippus what saucy old man that was, that without leave had burst into the house of an afflicted widow to hinder her paying PG 414 her tears, as she pretended, to the dead. Then the duke declaring himself, and threatening her for having corrupted his son, giving her the reproachful terms of witch and sorceress, Leucippus mildly answered that he did her wrong. The bad woman, imagining that the prince for very fear would not betray their secret, now conceived a project of monstrous wickedness, which was no less than to ensnare the father with the same arts which had subdued the son, that she might no longer be a concealed wife, nor a princess only under cover, but by a union with the old man become at once the true and acknowledged Duchess of Lycia. In a posture of humility she confessed her ignorance of the duke's quality, but now she knew it she besought his pardon for her wild speeches, which proceeded, she said, from a distempered head, which the loss of her dear husband had affected. He might command her life, she told him, which was now of small value to her. The tears which had accompanied her words and her mourning weeds, which, for a blind to the world, she had not yet cast off, heightening her beauty, gave a credence to her protestations of her innocence, but the Duke continuing to assail her with reproaches, with a matchless confidence, assuming the air of injured virtue, in a somewhat lofty tone she replied, that though he were her sovereign to whom in any lawful cause she was bound to submit, yet if he sought to take away her honour, she stood up to defy him. That, she said, was a jewel dearer than any he could give her, which so long as she should keep she should esteem herself richer than all the princes of the earth that were without it. If the prince, his son, knew anything to her dishonour, let him tell it. And here she challenged Leucippus before his father to speak the worst of her. If he would, however, sacrifice a woman's character to please an unjust humour of the Duke's, she saw no remedy, she said, now he was dead, meaning her late husband, that with his life would have defended her reputation. Thus appealed to Leucippus, who had stood a while astonished at her confident falsehoods, though ignorant of the full drift of them, considering that not the reputation only, but probably the life of a woman whom he had so loved, and who had made such sacrifices to him of love and beauty, depended upon his absolute concealment of their contract, framed his mouth to a compassionate untruth, and with solemn asseverations confirmed to his father her assurances of her innocence. Pg 415, he denied not that with rich gifts he had assailed her virtue, but had found her relentless to his solicitations, that gold nor greatness had any power over her. Nay, so far he went on to give force to the protestations of this artful woman, that he confessed to having offered marriage to her, which she, who scorned to listen to any second wedlock, had rejected. All this while Leucippus secretly prayed to heaven to forgive him while he uttered these bold untruths, since it was for the prevention of a greater mischief only, and had no malice in it. But warned by the sad sequel which ensued, be thou careful, young reader, how in any case you tell a lie. Lie not if any man but ask you how you do, or what o'clock it is. Be sure you make no false excuse to screen a friend that is most dear to you. Never let the most well-intended falsehood escape your lips. For heaven, which is entirely truth, will make the seed which you have sown of untruth to yield miseries 1,000-fold upon yours, as it did upon the head of the ill-fated and mistaken Leucippus. Leontius, finding the assurances of Barca so confidently seconded by his son, could no longer withhold his belief, and only forbidding their meeting for the future, took a courteous leave of the lady, presenting her at the same time with a valuable ring, in recompense, as he said, of the injustice which he had done her in his false surmises of her guiltiness. In truth, the surpassing beauty of the lady, with her appearing modesty, had made no less impression upon the heart of the fond old Duke than they had awakened in the bosom of his more pardonable son. His first design was to make her his mistress, to the better accomplishing of which Leucippus was dismissed from the court, under the pretext of some honourable employment abroad. In his absence, Leontius spared no offers to induce her to comply with his purpose. Continually he solicited her with rich offers, with messages, and by personal visits. It was a ridiculous sight, if it were not rather a sad one, to behold this second and worse dotage, which by Cupid's wrath had fallen upon this fantastical old new lover. All his occupation now was in dressing and pranking himself up in youthful attire to please the eyes of his new mistress. His mornings were employed in the devising of trim fashions, in the company of tailors, embroiderers, and feather dressers. So infatuated was he with Pg 416 these vanities, that when a servant came and told him that his daughter was dead, even she, whom he had but lately so highly prized, the words seemed spoken to a deaf person. He either could not or would not understand them, but, like one senseless, fell to babbling about the shape of a new hose and doublet. His crutch, the faithful prop of long-aged years, was discarded, and he resumed the youthful fashion of a sword by his side, when his years wanted strength to have drawn it. In this condition of folly it was no difficult task for the widow, by affected pretences of honour and arts of amorous denial, to draw in this doting Duke to that which she had all along aimed at, the offer of his crown in marriage. She was now Duchess of Lycia. In her new elevation the mask was quickly thrown aside, and the impious Barca appeared in her true qualities. She had never loved the Duke her husband, but had used him as the instrument of her greatness. Taking advantage of his amorous folly, which seemed to gain growth the nearer he approached to his grave, she took upon her the whole rule of Lycia, placing and displacing at her will all the great officers of state, and filling the court with creatures of her own, the agents of her guilty pleasures. She removed from the Duke's person the oldest and trustiest of his dependents. Leucippus, who at this juncture was returned from his foreign mission, was met at once with the news of his sister's death and the strange wedlock of the old Duke. To the memory of Hydaspes he gave some tears, but these were swiftly swallowed up in his horror and detestation of the conduct of Barca, In his first fury, he resolved upon a full disclosure of all that had passed between him and his wicked stepmother. Again he thought by killing Barker to rid the world of a monster, but tenderness for his father recalled him to milder counsels. The fatal secret, nevertheless, sat upon him like lead, while he was determined to confide it to no other. It took his sleep away, and his desire of food. And if a thought of mirth at any time crossed him, the dreadful truth would recur to check it, as if a messenger should have come to whisper to him of some friend's death. With difficulty he was brought to wish their highnesses faint joy of their marriage, and at the first sight of Barker, a friend was fain to hold his wrist hard to prevent him from fainting. In an interview which after, at her request, he had with her PG 417 alone, the bad woman shamed not to take up the subject lightly, to treat as a trifle the marriage vow that had passed between them, and seeing him sad and silent, to threaten him with the displeasure of the Duke, his father, if by words or looks he gave any suspicion to the world of their dangerous secret. What had happened, she said, was by no fault of hers. People would have thought her mad if she had refused the Duke's offer. She had used no arts to entrap his father. It was Leucippus's own resolute denial of any such thing as a contract having passed between them which had led to the proposal. The prince, unable to extenuate his share of blame in the calamity, humbly besought her, that since by his own great fault things had been brought to their present pass, she would only live honest for the future, and not abuse the credulous age of the old Duke, as he well knew she had the power to do for himself, seeing that life was no longer desirable to him. If his death was judged by her to be indispensable to her security, she was welcome to lay what trains she pleased to compass it, so long as she would only suffer his father to go to his grave in peace, since he had never wronged her. This temperate appeal was lost upon the heart of Barker, who from that moment was secretly bent upon effecting the destruction of Leucippus. Her project was, by feeding the ears of the Duke with exaggerated praises of his son, to awaken a jealousy in the old man that she secretly preferred Leucippus. Next, by wilfully insinuating the great popularity of the prince, which was no more indeed than the truth, among the Lycians, to instill subtle fears into the Duke that his son had laid plots for circumventing his life and throne. By these arts she was working upon the weak mind of the Duke almost to distraction, when at a meeting, concocted by herself between the prince and his father, the latter taking Leucippus soundly to task for these alleged treasons, the prince replied only by humbly drawing his sword, with the intention of laying it at his father's feet, and begging him, since he suspected him, to sheath it in his own bosom, for of his life he had been long weary. Barker entered at the crisis, and ere Leucippus could finish his submission, with loud outcries alarmed the courtiers, who, rushing into the presence, found the prince, with sword in hand indeed, but with far other intentions than this bad woman imputed to PG 418 him, plainly accusing him of having drawn it upon his father. Leucippus was quickly disarmed, and the old Duke, trembling between fear and age, committed him to close prison, from which, by Barker's aims, he never should have come out alive but for the interference of the common people, who, loving their prince, and equally detesting Barker in a simultaneous mutiny, arose and rescued him from the hands of the officers. The court was now no longer a place of living for Leucippus, and hastily thanking his countrymen for his deliverance, which in his heart he rather deprecated than welcomed, as one that wished for death, he took leave of all court hopes, and abandoning the palace, betook himself to a life of penitence in solitudes. Not so secretly did he select his place of penance, in a cave among lonely woods and fastnesses, but that his retreat was traced by Barker, who, baffled in her purpose, raging like some she-wolf, dispatched an emissary of her own to destroy him privately. There was residing at the court of Lycia at this time a young maiden, the daughter of Barker by her first husband, who had hitherto been brought up in the obscurity of a poor country abode with an uncle, but whom Barker now publicly owned, and had prevailed upon the easy Duke to adopt as successor to the throne in wrong of the true heir, his suspected son Leucippus. This young creature, Urania by name, was as artless and harmless as her mother was crafty and wicked. To the unnatural Barker she had been an object of neglect and aversion, and for the project of supplanting Leucippus only had she fetched her out of retirement. The bringing up of Urania had been among country hinds and lasses. To tend her flocks or superintend her neat dairy had been the extent of her breeding. From her calling she had contracted a pretty rusticity of dialect, which among the fine folks of the court passed for simplicity and folly. She was the unfittest instrument for an ambitious design that could be chosen, for her manners in a palace had a tinge still of her old occupation, and to her mind the lowly shepherdess's life was best. Simplicity is oft a match for prudence, and Urania was not so simple but she understood that she had been sent for to court only in the prince's wrong, and in her heart she was PG 419 determined to defeat any designs that might be contriving against her brother-in-law. The melancholy bearing of Leucippus had touched her with pity. This wrought in her a kind of love, which for its object had no further end than the well-being of the beloved. She looked for no return of it, nor did the possibility of such a blessing in the remotest way occur to her. So vast a distance she had imaged between her lowly bringing up and the courtly breeding and graces of Leucippus. Hers was no raging flame, such as had burned destructive in the bosom of poor Hydaspes. Either the vindictive god in mercy had spared this young maiden, or the wrath of the confounding Cupid was restrained by a higher power from discharging the most malignant of his arrows against the peace of so much innocence. Of the extent of her mother's malice she was too guileless to have entertained conjecture, but from hints and whispers, and above all, from that tender watchfulness with which a true affection like Urania's tends the safety of its object, fearing even where no cause for fear subsists, she gathered that some danger was impending over the prince, and with simple heroism resolved to countermine the treason. It chanced upon a day that Leucippus had been indulging his sad meditations in forests far from human converse, when he was struck with the appearance of a human being, so unusual in that solitude. There stood before him a seeming youth of delicate appearance, clad in coarse and peasantly attire. He was come, he said, to seek out the prince and to be his poor boy and servant if he would let him. Alas! Poor youth, replied Leucippus, why do you follow me, who am as poor as you are? In good faith, was his pretty answer, I shall be well and rich enough if you will but love me. And saying so he wept. The prince, admiring this strange attachment in a boy, was moved with compassion, and seeing him exhausted, as if with long travel and hunger, invited him into his poor habitation, setting such refreshments before him as that barren spot afforded. But by no entreaties could he be prevailed upon to take any sustenance, and all that day, and for the two following, he seemed supported only by some gentle flame of love that was within him. He fed only upon the sweet looks and courteous entertainment which he received from Leucippus. Seemingly he wished to die under PG 420 the loving eyes of his master. I cannot eat, he prettily said, but I shall eat tomorrow. You will be dead by that time, said Leucippus. I shall be well then, said he, since you will not love me. Then the prince asked him why he sighed so. To think, was his innocent reply, that such a fine man as you should die and no gay lady love him. But you will love me, said Leucippus. Yes, sure, said he, till I die, and when I am in heaven I shall wish for you. This is a love, thought the other, that I never yet heard tell of, but come, thou art sleepy, child, go in and I will sit with thee. Then, from some words which the poor youth dropped, Leucippus, suspecting that his wits were beginning to ramble, said, What portends this? I am not sleepy, said the youth, but you are sad. I would that I could do anything to make you merry. Shall I sing? But soon, as if recovering strength, there is one approaching, he wildly cried out. Master, look to yourself. His words were true, for now entered with provided weapon the wicked emissary of Barca that we told of, and directing a mortal thrust at the prince, the supposed boy, with a last effort interposing his weak body, received it in his bosom, thanking the heavens in death that he had saved so good a master. Leucippus, having slain the villain, was at leisure to discover, in the features of his poor servant, the countenance of his devoted sister-in-law. Through solitary and dangerous ways she had sought him in that disguise, and finding him, seems to have resolved upon a voluntary death by fasting, partly that she might die in the presence of her beloved, and partly that she might make known to him in death the love which she wanted boldness to disclose to him while living, but chiefly because she knew that by her demise all obstacles would be removed that stood between her prince and his succession to the throne of Lycia. Leucippus had hardly time to comprehend the strength of love in his Urania when a trampling of horses resounded through his solitude. It was a party of Lycian horsemen that had come to seek him, dragging the detested Barca in their train, who was now to receive the full penalty of her misdeeds. Amidst her frantic fury upon the missing of her daughter, the old duke had suddenly died, not without suspicion of her PG 421 having administered poison to him. Her punishment was submitted to Leucippus, who was now, with joyful acclaims, saluted as the rightful Duke of Lycia. He, as no way moved with his great wrongs, but considering her simply as the parent of Urania, saluting her only by the title of wicked mother, bade her to live. That reverend title, he said, and pointed to the bleeding remains of her child, must be her pardon. He would use no extremity against her, but leave her to heaven. The hardened mother, not at all relenting at the sad spectacle that lay before her, but making show of dutiful submission to the young duke, and with bended knees approaching him, suddenly with a dagger inflicted a mortal stab upon him, and with a second stroke stabbing herself, ended both their wretched lives. Now was the tragedy of Cupid's wrath awfully completed, and the race of Leontius failing in the deaths of both his children, the chronicle relates that, under their new duke Ismenus, the offence to the angry power was expiated. His statues and altars were, with more magnificence than ever, re-edified, and he ceased thenceforth from plaguing the land. Thus far the pagan historians relate erring, but from this vain idle story a not unprofitable moral may be gathered against the abuse of the natural, but dangerous passion of love. In the story of Hydaspes we see the preposterous linking of beauty with deformity, of princely expectancies with mean and low conditions, in the case of the prince her brother, and of decrepit age with youth in the ill end of their doting father, Leontius. By their examples we are warned to decline all unequal and ill-assorted unions. pg 422, pg 423,